Okay, imagine this, all right? Imagine like a world where, we don't have to pay taxes anymore.
No taxes.
Yeah, no income tax, sales tax, none of it gone. What if the government could just like create the money it needed
Wow.
for everything, for roads, for schools, for healthcare?
That sounds kind of like a fantasy world, doesn't it?
It does, right. It sounds too good to be true. But there's this theory, it's called modern monetary theory.
Okay, MMT.
Yeah, MMT. And it suggests that maybe this isn't just a total pipe dream.
Interesting.
I'm Edward.
I'm Lily, and welcome to Dansplain.
Where we do a deep dive into all these ideas that kind of challenge the way we think about the world.
Exactly. And today we're diving into the world of MMT.
MMT.
And the idea of like getting rid of taxes for good.
Yeah. So, learner, you sent us a bunch of information about MMT, and your big question seems to be, is eliminating taxes a viable economic strategy? Or is it just wishful thinking?
That's a great question and a big one.
So today we're going to unpack MMT, figure out what it's all about, look at the potential benefits and the risks involved.
We're going to analyze it all.
And see if we can figure out if and how this system could actually work in the real world.
Sounds good.
So, Lily, let's start with the basics here. What is the core idea behind MMT? Like, how does it actually work? Because it seems to go against everything we've been taught about government and money.
Well, Edward, it all starts with this idea of fiat currency. That's basically the money that governments issue, like the US dollar, the euro, etc. And it's not backed by any physical thing like gold.
Right.
MMT says that governments that control their own fiat currency have this unique ability. They can create as much money as they need.
So they're not limited like a household budget.
Exactly. They don't run out of money in the same way we do.
It's a pretty big idea to get your head around. But hold on, what about taxes then? Because we're always told that governments need our tax dollars to, pay for all the things they do.
That's the common understanding, yeah.
So if taxes aren't really about funding the government, according to MMT, what's their purpose?
Well, MMT sees taxes more as a tool to manage the economy. It's about keeping inflation in check by basically taking some money out of circulation.
Right.
And then also about sort of steering resources in the economy. So instead of seeing taxes as the fuel for the government, MMT sees them more like the brakes and the steering wheel.
Oh, okay. I like that analogy.
Yeah, it helps to kind of visualize it.
Yeah, so if taxes aren't about funding the government, then MMT is basically saying that things like, roads and schools and healthcare could all be funded.
Right.
By just creating more money.
That's the radical proposition here.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds incredible, right?
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are some pretty big downsides to consider as well.
Absolutely. It's not as simple as it sounds.
Yeah, so let's start with what could be the potential benefits. If we lived in a world without taxes, but with MMT principles in place.
What could that look like?
Exactly what would be the good things?
Yeah. Okay, well, one of the main things that MMT supporters point to is economic stimulus. Think about it. If the government can just directly fund public services by creating money, they can basically pump money into the economy whenever it's needed.
So it's like an instant boost.
Yeah, exactly. And this could lead to more jobs, more growth, especially during recessions when things are slow. The source material even mentions the COVID-19 pandemic and how those government stimulus checks really helped prop up the economy.
Right. I remember those.
It shows the power of direct injections.
Yeah. I mean, our tax system right now, it's just so complicated. It's a whole bureaucracy.
It is.
There's all this paperwork and regulations, and it just seems so inefficient.
It's a huge burden, not just for the government, but for businesses and individuals, too. Just imagine all the time and resources we could save if we didn't have to deal with this complex tax collection system.
Yeah, it's almost mind-boggling.
It is.
I mean, it's like a whole industry built around taxes.
Exactly.
Now, the source material also mentions fairness. How could MMT potentially make things fairer?
Okay, so right now, a lot of tax systems include what are called regressive taxes. These are taxes that hit low-income earners harder.
So it's like a bigger chunk of their income.
Exactly. It's not proportional. Now, MMT argues that by getting rid of taxes and funding everything through money creation, you could create a system that's much fairer.
Where everyone contributes equally.
In a way, yeah. At least the burden isn't heavier on those who can least afford it.
I see. So it's about shifting the burden.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are some potential benefits. But now let's talk about the risks, because I'm sure a lot of people listening are thinking, well, what about inflation?
Yeah, inflation is the big elephant in the room when it comes to MMT.
So explain that for me. What's the connection?
Okay, so basically, if the government creates too much money, and the economy isn't producing enough goods and services to keep up with all that new money, then each dollar becomes worth less.
So things get more expensive.
Exactly. And that's inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods.
And that can get out of control pretty quickly, right? Like we've seen hyperinflation in history where money becomes basically worthless.
Absolutely. And another big risk is currency devaluation. If people start losing faith in the currency because they think the government is printing too much of it or spending it recklessly,
Okay.
then its value can plummet compared to other currencies.
So that would make imports way more expensive.
Exactly. And that could further fuel inflation domestically. And then there's the issue of fiscal discipline.
Yeah, right. If there's no need to collect taxes to fund things, is there a danger that governments might just overspend?
It's a legitimate concern. Without that constraint of having to raise taxes, governments might become less careful with their spending. They might overspend or misallocate funds for political reasons.
It's like a blank check.
In a way, yeah. And that could lead to all sorts of problems down the line.
So basically, MMT seems to depend on a lot of things going right.
It does. It's not a simple solution.
Yeah, the source material actually outlines 8 ideal conditions that would have to be in place.
8 conditions.
Yeah, 8. For a tax-free system to actually work.
Yeah.
So let's go through them one by one. The first one is sufficient economic slack.
Okay, economic slack. What does that even mean?
Yeah, good question. So slack basically means that there are unused resources in the economy.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, it could be things like high unemployment. That means there are people who are ready and willing to work but can't find jobs.
Right.
Or factories that are operating below capacity.
I see.
So it's basically anything that's not being used to its full potential.
Okay, so why is slack so important for MMT?
Because the idea is that if there's all this unused capacity in the economy, then you can inject more money without immediately causing inflation. Like, imagine a stadium with a bunch of empty seats.
Okay.
You can sell more tickets without having to raise the price.
I get it. So the source material actually uses the COVID-19 pandemic as an example.
Right.
Because during the pandemic, there was a sudden drop in economic activity, lots of businesses shut down, people lost their jobs.
Right.
So there was this huge amount of slack in the economy. And that's partly why those big government spending programs didn't immediately cause massive inflation.
That makes sense.
Right.
But how do you actually measure how much slack there is in an economy? Seems pretty tricky.
It is. It's not an exact science. You have to look at indicators like unemployment rates and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's not a perfect system. And if policymakers get it wrong, if they think there's more slack than there actually is, then they could end up creating too much money and triggering inflation.
Okay, so that's a big caveat.
It is.
All right. The second ideal condition is effective inflation control mechanisms.
So if we're not using taxes as the main way to control inflation, what else is there?
Yeah, good question. The source material mentions a few alternatives. One is monetary policy.
Okay, monetary policy, what's that?
So that's basically when the central bank raises interest rates to make borrowing more expensive.
So if it costs more to borrow money,
Yeah,
people will spend less.
exactly. Which should help cool down the economy and keep inflation in check. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
Raising interest rates can also work against the whole point of creating money to stimulate the economy.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
It is. Another option is government bonds.
Okay, bonds. How do those work?
Well, when the government sells bonds, they're essentially taking money out of the economy because people are buying those bonds. But it's kind of like deferred taxes because the government has to pay back those bonds with interest eventually.
So it's like kicking the can down the road.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's price controls, which is basically the government setting limits on how much things can cost.
Price controls.
Yeah, but those usually don't work very well. They often lead to shortages and other problems.
Right, they can distort the market.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so finding effective ways to control inflation without taxes is a major challenge for MMT.
It is, no doubt about it. Okay, condition number 3. Strong currency confidence.
Okay, why is that so important?
Well, imagine if people lose faith in the currency.
Right.
They start thinking the government's just printing money willy-nilly.
Yeah.
What happens?
They will panic.
Yeah, they panic. They start dumping the currency. Its value plummets.
Imports become super expensive.
Exactly, and the whole economy can just spiral downwards.
It's a disaster.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you maintain that confidence?
Well, transparency is key. People need to understand why the government is creating money, how much they're creating, and what it's being used for.
Right, no shady business.
Exactly. And the government also needs to have a good track record of managing the economy responsibly.
To build that trust.
Exactly. And in some cases, maybe even international backing for the currency could help.
Okay, so confidence is key.
Absolutely.
All right, the fourth condition, balanced trade or export strength.
Trade. So how does international trade fit into all of this?
Okay, think about it. If a country imports a lot of stuff
Okay.
and its currencies suddenly devalue,
Things get expensive fast.
yeah, those imports become way more expensive, which fuels inflation, right? And all the potential benefits of not having taxes just disappear.
It backfires.
Yeah, it backfires big time. But if a country has a strong export sector or doesn't rely heavily on imports,
Then it's more protected.
exactly, they've got a buffer against currency devaluation. The source material actually mentions Japan as a good example.
Japan.
Yeah, Japan has a history of running these massive money creation programs, something called quantitative easing.
Right. QE.
Yeah, but they haven't seen the kind of crazy inflation that some people predicted.
So why is that?
Well, it's partly because they're a major exporter.
So their stuff is still in demand globally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, there are other factors at play, like their deflationary pressures, but a strong export sector definitely helps.
Interesting.
So it's about having that balance in the global market.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to condition number 5. Political and institutional stability.
Stability, yeah, that makes sense. But why is it especially important for MMT?
Because if you give a government the power to just create money whenever they want,
There's a risk of abuse.
there's a huge risk of abuse. They could just print money to fund their pet projects
Yeah.
or to win elections or whatever.
Oh, wow, yeah, that would be bad.
Yeah. So you need strong institutions to prevent that. You need an independent central bank that can't be pressured by politicians.
Okay. To keep things in check.
Exactly. You need clear rules, transparency, and accountability to make sure the system isn't being manipulated.
Checks and balances, yeah.
Yeah, checks and balances are absolutely crucial.
Makes sense.
All right, number 6, public acceptance and understanding.
So this is about getting people on board with the idea of MMT.
Exactly. If people don't understand how the system works, or if they're just scared of the government printing money,
It could cause panic.
it could cause total panic. People could start hoarding goods, dumping the currency, and the whole thing could unravel.
Wow. So even if the economic conditions are right,
Yeah,
a lack of trust can ruin everything.
it can ruin everything. So education is key. People need to understand how MMT works, what the safeguards are, and why it might actually be a good thing.
It's about making sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Condition number 7, calibrated money creation.
Okay. Calibrated, what does that mean?
So this is all about finding the right balance.
Okay.
You can't create too much money.
Because that would cause inflation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you also can't create too little.
Because then you wouldn't get the stimulus effect.
Exactly. So you need really accurate data, sophisticated models, and a lot of careful planning to figure out how much money to create and when to create it.
So there's a risk of getting it wrong?
There's a huge risk. If you overshoot even a little bit, you could trigger inflation and destabilize the whole thing.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is.
All right. Last condition. Deflationary pressures or economic downturns. Now, why are those situations seen as potentially good for MMT?
Okay, so deflation is basically when prices are falling,
Yep.
and an economic downturn is like a recession where there's low growth and high unemployment.
Right.
In those situations, the risk of inflation is much lower.
Because there's less demand.
Exactly. So creating more money in those scenarios might actually be a good way to stimulate the economy without causing prices to skyrocket.
So it's about timing.
It's about timing. It's about understanding the economic context and making sure that the conditions are right for MMT to actually work.
Interesting.
The source material mentions Japan again, with their long periods of low growth, and the U.S. after the 2008 financial crisis as examples of when money creation didn't lead to runaway inflation.
Right, because the economy needed a boost.
Exactly.
Okay, wow. So we've gone through all 8 conditions, and it's clear that for MMT to work, a lot of things would have to fall into place perfectly.
Yeah, and even then, the source material cautions us that success isn't guaranteed. There are still some broader risks and concerns to think about.
Like what?
Well, firstly, history is full of examples of hyperinflation, like in Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe.
Right, where money became worthless.
Exactly. Those are cautionary tales about what can happen when money creation gets out of control.
And it shows that MMT isn't a foolproof system.
Definitely not.
Ah.
Then there's the potential for global disruption. If one country suddenly ditches taxes and starts creating lots of money,
How would other countries react?
well, they might see it as an unfair advantage.
Right, like they're breaking the rule.
Yeah, they might retaliate with trade barriers or other measures.
So it could trigger a trade war.
They could. And domestically, shifting away from taxes could lead to big shifts in power.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the government doesn't need our taxes anymore, what's to stop them from just spending recklessly? We'd need new checks and balances to keep them accountable.
That's true. New rules for a new system.
Exactly. And the source material even suggests that maybe a hybrid approach might be better.
A hybrid approach.
Yeah, like maybe significantly reduce taxes, but not eliminate them entirely.
Okay.
And then use careful, calibrated money creation to supplement that.
So a more cautious approach.
Exactly, just to mitigate some of those risks.
That makes sense.
So, learner, we've done a pretty deep dive into MMT and the idea of a tax-free world.
It's been fascinating.
It is fascinating, right? It's a theory with some really appealing potential benefits, like boosting the economy and making things fairer.
It has a lot of potential.
It does, but as we've seen, there are also some very real risks and challenges that can't be ignored.
Like inflation, currency devaluation, and the potential for abuse.
Exactly. And ultimately, it seems that whether or not this could actually work in the real world depends on a whole bunch of very specific conditions being met.
And those conditions aren't easy to create or maintain.
Not at all.
So, learner, we've given you a lot to think about. What do you think? Are we ready for such a radical shift in how we think about government and money?
Or are the traditional guardrails of taxation still necessary?
Maybe a hybrid approach is the way to go.
Maybe.
It's a question with no easy answers.
There are no easy answers here, for sure.
But it's a conversation worth having.
It is. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about MMT and the big ideas shaping our world, be sure to like and subscribe to Dansplain for more.
Don't forget to check out our website, too.
Yeah, you can head over to www.dansplain.xyz for all our latest episodes, articles, links to our partner products, and more.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, and thanks for joining us.